Welcome to another episode of Inspired Voices, Motherhood Unfiltered edition. My name is Riera. It is the month of May. We're continuing the conversation of motherhood. If you see me wearing this shirt, it is because I am sponsored by Heart Warrior Legend. So if you want to support the Heart Warrior Legend brand, I'll leave a link in the description below for you. Also, if you have any comments or questions throughout this episode, leave them down below. We'll love to hear it. If you have any different perspectives, let us know what you think. All right. Tiffany Williamson.
Yes.
Welcome back.
I'm back.
We're number 4. All right. So today's topic is going to be parenting through the eyes of your inner child.
Ooh.
I feel like that's a deep one right there.
We're going to get hot and heavy on this one.
Yeah. It's almost like, growing up, I could see my parents' traumas come out, even though I didn't know what that was. But thinking back, like that was trauma that they were having.
Yeah.
And so I guess how can parents navigate or realize that it's their inner child coming out?
One, it's knowing, so like you mentioned, you kind of saw their traumas, and I bet that also impacted how they parented you. Because the thing about trauma, if it's not something you've worked through, it will show up.
Yeah.
Whether it's a parenting trauma that then shows up when you parent, whether it shows up in other aspects of relationships or community, etc. That's the thing about traumas. Even if it's a trauma that you think that you have healed from, but maybe you really haven't done the work to heal, it may show up, especially in parenting, because your children are almost like blank canvases. So they are just reacting to the world, but sometimes their reactions may be triggering for you. So one of the first triggers that we typically start to see that may lead back to something that happened in your own childhood or your inner child trauma or work, as we call it, is when your child is a newborn. Infants cry. That is their main way to respond to the world. You were a crying infant, which I feel like we've talked about before, like the struggle of that just on a mom and the mental weight of it. But another aspect of that, the very sound of it may be something that's triggering for you, because maybe when you were growing up as a child and you made loud shrieking noises, you were punished. You weren't allowed to make those noises. So that now you hear your child making those noises, and it almost puts your body into fight or flight sometimes, because you don't know how to respond to it, because you were never shown, okay, well, if someone's crying, let me, show love. Let me show care and attention. It may have been met with more or other tactics. Yeah. So now when your own child's crying, it may cause you to say, well, how do I react to it? And for those of us that maybe worked through, okay, this is what happened when I was a child, I want to do differently now, you'll be able to recognize in the moment, okay, this is my chance to kind of respond differently. But that may not always be the case. You may not know that's a trigger for you, and you may be responding negatively and not recognizing why you're responding negatively, or that it's a negative response until maybe you watch a show or you're around other parents and you realize your response to a child crying is vastly different than the other moms or the other parents. And then you're like, well, who's right or who's wrong here? And that's, in a nutshell, how triggers can start to come about, or you start to notice your triggers, because a lot of times you do parent in a silo. It's just whatever you kind of say goes and how you're going about parenting. But then when you're around other parents, that's when you start to notice the differences in my parenting style versus your parenting style. In response to triggers.
Do you think it's a good thing for kind of moms to get together to see different parenting styles? And
I don't think so much in that respect, but I think it's worth acknowledging with other moms or moms that you feel comfortable with how you parent through your triggers, and recognizing when you have a trigger that's been activated. I would say how to parent through that, because ultimately, if you're noticing a trigger, if you're noticing, okay, when I'm in a situation that's a sensory overload, I'm hearing a lot of noise, a lot of kids playing, that's triggering a negative reaction, even though, my kid's not doing anything. They're just enjoying their life, yelling and playing. Why is that causing me to have a negative reaction? I like to also always reassure moms, the fact that you're even giving it that second thought and thinking about it is already showing you're making a shift from however you were parented.
Yeah. And you want to catch it before you get into the red zone too, right?
Exactly. But sometimes you don't know it's about to lead you into the red zone until it happens. Because if you don't know, okay, when I was growing up as a kid, I wasn't able to yell. I wasn't able to, we had to be quiet in the house or something. If you don't know that's a trigger or recognize that as a trigger. Because even though, okay, maybe you grew up in a home that you guys weren't yelling and playing loudly, that doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad thing growing up.
Yeah.
But you may recognize now, okay, I have kids. It's normal for them to yell. It's normal for them to make noise. But why am I having such a negative reaction to them living life?
Yeah.
That's a sign that, hey, this might be a trigger. Let's talk about it. Let's think about it.
Well, some people might say oh yeah, okay, I can ask myself that question, but I don't know the answer, so they just kind of drop it.
That's also true. You could also be like, okay, acknowledge, but then what?
Right,
in those moments, that's probably the time where it's key in extra help. Tagging in another mom, tagging in a therapist, tagging in your support system to say, okay, how do I kind of unlearn feeling such a negative reaction to noise? Or, triggers may come in where, maybe in your household, cleanliness was next to godliness. So there was always a clean house, and kids make messes. That is naturally a kid. They're going to put stuff out because they're exploring. They're not thinking about putting it back up into a nice, neat, perfect way for you to have a clean house. But that may trigger you. That may be a trigger that you didn't realize going into having a baby, et cetera, that you're going to be triggered and that having a clean house is not innate to a child. So how to not negatively react immediately, but how do I kind of train my child in a way that they also embody cleanliness is next to godliness? Or you also work on your trigger so that way it's not such a big deal to you and that you're now yelling at your child or punishing them for literally kids being kids.
Let me ask you something. This is more of a personal question, but it fits in.
Okay.
So when you heal from a trauma to heal those triggers, are you really healing or just navigating how to work around it or something like that? Because this thing happens in this form. It triggered me. Now I'm healed from it. But then this other thing happens. I thought I was healed from this, but this other thing that's completely different from that one is triggering the same thing.
Then I would say you weren't all the way healed. There was some aspect of it that you may have healed. The thing with trauma, it's usually, I always say it's like an onion. There's the outer layer, then you got to peel back, there's more layers. And the things with trauma, they may be ascribed to very different reasons. So you may, like I said, going back to the sensory overload, which is causing you to yell and react negatively to your child for literally making noise. It could be because, okay, well, when I was growing up, that wasn't allowed. So I was never taught how to properly manage sound in the household because if I made a sound, it was negative. Then there's the trauma of, well, I wasn't able to do it, so how are my kids going to be able to do it? And if my kids are able to do it, how do I quiet that part in me that's like, oh my God, noise is being made, someone's going to get in trouble. Now, not recognizing you're the parent, nobody's going to get you in trouble. And if you let your kids do it, that's fine. But what it does and why we say it's that inner child, because that inner child starts piping up saying, wait, we're making noise. We don't want to get in trouble. And then that's causing you to kind of move into that fight or flight, which then maybe as a parent, it's like yelling, no, everybody calm down, no running, no making noise. Or it's causing you to overperform, where sometimes you're moving, you recognize, okay, I have this trauma, so I'm not going to yell. I'm just going to let it be. But now I'm overstimulated silently in the corner. So those are the areas of which you really have to kind of peel back those layers and kind of heal layer by layer.
Yeah.
Because you may, in fact, have healed the ability to be with a whole bunch of kids and not have that sensory overload, but you may not have healed the ability to not get overstimulated.
Man.
And then when you're overstimulated, you don't know what to do with that. How do I manage that?
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Because, like, I remember our first episode, we talked about how moms have to do so many things. And now healing on top of that, your inner child.
Oh, yeah.
That's another thing. It's
Yes.
whew.
Oh, yes. Just adds to the mental weight of motherhood. Because agreed. And I would say, especially in this generation, we have a lot of moms that are utilizing therapy. So you may know of your triggers. They may not be foreign to you. And you may recognize, okay, when I have kids, I want to change X, 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 and X.
Yeah.
That's fine. But it's something to be said when you're in the moment with your child and they are literally the embodiment of that trigger. And then you're now having to act out in all of the ways in your head. They're like, well, when my child does this, I will respond in this way. It may be harder to do when you already have the overstimulation from other stuff. It may be harder to do when you've been working all day and now you're trying to put on your mom hat and just get dinner done. But they're over here triggering all of these things.
Yeah.
So you're constantly having to kind of prioritize yourself in a way and take a step back and say, okay, you know what? I'm overstimulated because of X, X, and X. Let me just go to the room for 20 minutes and just like breathe. So that way I could even pretend to respond appropriately. I always
So that's kind of like the first step?
Always. If you don't know what else to do, or maybe you haven't had therapy or talked about how to kind of get around the trauma or the trigger, removing yourself safely, of course, if your kids are of age where you can just disappear for 10 minutes into the closet or to a room and just breathe. Let me calm myself down. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Yeah. I say that especially to my moms that maybe have a child who is a crier, especially the infants.
Yeah.
Some infants cry more than others, and that can be very triggering without it being an inner child thing, period. Let me make that clear. But if you already have an inner child thing about noise, because babies' cries are very shrill. It's very high pitched. So that's going to be and the purpose of that is to get the parents' attention. So it automatically can just be triggering just on the basis of like, I hear this loud, shrill noise. Maybe it has nothing to do with the inner child, anything. It's just, it's a lot to hear.
Yeah.
And if you have a baby that they do that a lot, I always say, put baby in a safe place. It's okay to walk away for a few minutes just to like breathe. Just to,
Man, I feel bad for my mom.
she probably would appreciate hearing it because she probably remembers them days of you just crying.
I mean, I was not only a crying baby, but I was a C-section baby. And she was in a new country. They didn't know anybody.
Yeah.
And my dad would have to go to work.
Yeah.
And she would be alone with my sister and me, the crying baby. And she's like, I asked her one time, I was like, was I a crying baby? And she's like, yeah, she just had this like,
it took her back.
Yeah.
Took her back for a second and she had to remember something. Ooh, he grown now. Took her back. But that's one of those things where I say the same for new moms, moms of infants, but also as the kids get older, that same philosophy still applies. It's okay to take a breather because again, we're human. Just like your kids are doing normal kid things, it's okay for you to be triggered about something or to have sensory overload. It's okay for you to be overstimulated. The goal of parenting is not perfection, but it's to acknowledge those moments where you're like, okay, this is hard, this is challenging. How do I navigate this?
Yeah.
And that also involves you taking a step back and just like, well, let me just breathe for a second before I respond or before I go to level 10. Let me just take a second.
Yeah.
And I always say that should definitely be the first part. If you don't have any other skills to kind of manage the trigger that's happening, let me take a step back for a second and really just be like, ooh, okay, I'm getting triggered.
So, we talked a lot about how the first things that they could do and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, you talk a little bit more about like the boundaries that we have to set for ourselves.
The boundaries.
And not just boundaries, but like some other techniques that we could use in order to heal that inner child.
Definitely. I mean, boundaries is always something I talk to everyone about. You should always have boundaries because it will help.
That was a previous
Yeah,
episode.
I was like, I feel like we talked about this because boundary. I'm a big boundary person.
Right.
Boundaries can always help you when you're navigating very challenging situations. But some other tools that I've seen really help when you especially are dealing with inner child traumas that are coming up as you're now trying to parent your child is if you are able to have a conversation with your parent. Sometimes the acknowledgement of like, hey mom, or hey dad, when I was growing up, it really wasn't cool when I, wasn't able to voice my opinion or I wasn't able to really kind of be my true authentic self because of X, Y, and Z, and literally having a discussion. And I'm not saying going in with you did wrong, more so having that discussion. That can be really healing. That could be
stay away
something.
from you statements.
Exactly. Don't want to trigger in the conversation, but that could be really healing. And simply sometimes the acknowledgement from your parents can almost heal you as the child of like, okay, you see me in that moment, you recognize like, hey, I could have done better.
Yeah. It's harder for boomer parents, especially to actually like remember what they did. Right?
Again, I say this with a lot of things. It's hard to have to take acknowledgement and acceptance when you're the one in the wrong. This is why I say sometimes those apologies at any age can be hard to do because sometimes you have to be the one to sit in the uncomfortable and say you're right. I didn't do that as well as I should have. Yeah. But I'll do better going forward.
Right. I think one of the things that really helped me, I mean, I'm not a parent yet. But one of the things that I have worked and healed my inner child, don't know if it's completely healed, but one of the things that helped me was to do like a hypnosis and go back into my inner child and tell him like it's okay, I love you, all is forgiven, all these things and stuff like that.
Absolutely. You're bringing up a really good point. It's okay to talk to your inner child, especially if there is a pivotal age where like at 13, this is when I really had to shift who I was for safety or whatever. If there's an important stage in your life, in your childhood where things shifted. Yeah. And that's the age you need to really go back to and kind of speak to your 13-year-old self, 14-year-old self. And that's part of therapy. We have a thing called the empty chair technique. And that's where we can do two things. If you do not have the relationship with your parent where you can kind of have that discussion, we'll tell you to envision your parent sitting in that empty chair and tell them. And the goal of that is for you to really start to verbalize. Interesting. And get it out. Yeah. Because what we find, a lot of times you're keeping it on the inside. You're not verbalizing it, and it's just continuing to well on the inside. But as you start to speak it, it helps you to heal a little bit just to even get it out. Because sometimes there are things that you may hold on the inside that you haven't even verbalized. Yeah. So that empty chair technique really helps with that. But we'll also do that as well, and we'll say, visualize speaking to your 13-year-old self. Go back to who he or she was and let her know that you're okay now. Let her know we're no longer in that safe environment. If it was a situation where you couldn't have a voice at home, you can, speak to that 13-year-old self and say, I have a voice now. I speak all the time.
Do you do that with your clients? Like
I do.
In the session?
Yeah, in the session. We'll do that. And if I have clients that like to write, if they're people that like to write letters or they're more writers, journalers, I say write a letter to your dad, to your mom. And it doesn't have to be something that you send them. You certainly can if that's, again, your mode of communication. But there's something to getting it out. Yeah. And laying it bare, even for yourself, just to see it written out on paper, it's almost a release in that way of like, ooh, I've gotten that out. I've said it. And you may not have to say it to the other person, or you may find like, okay, well, the next step for me is I do have to say it. And we'll do the same with the inner child.
How do you know if you have to say it to your parent, if you're not completely healed?
Yeah, if you're reading it to yourself and let's say you're interacting with your parent often and there's a level of dysfunction there that's tied to this particular trauma or hurt, and it's preventing your parent-child relationship from going forward, absolutely talk to them about it. Because how is the parent supposed to know that this has been impacting you if you haven't even brought it up?
Right.
because unless you've been talking about it, your parent may not think this incident that happened at 13 or, when you were a child, us not allowing you to have a voice or this, that, or third is now impacting you as an adult.
Yeah.
So you almost have to bring that to their attention to have that discussion so healing can occur.
Interesting. Yeah. And I guess it depends how open that parent is too, because like sometimes
100%.
Sometimes they're not, and then 100%. It comes to a point where you don't want them to see their grandchild or something like that, right?
It definitely has gone and can go to extremes. It depends on the client, and it also depends on what the trauma we're talking about. Are we talking about straight up abuse, or are we talking about, maybe something that's hurtful, but you have a parent that's actively trying to be in your life versus someone that, something traumatic has happened to me and I'm trying to talk to you about it, but you're the type of parent that never wants to hear my truth. It may be hard for you to then have to accept the reality of the parent that you have versus the fairy tale of the one that you really wanted to show up for you. And that's where you'll see clients start to talk about a no contact. If they keep trying with the parent, hey, I'm trying to kind of help you, help me kind of thing. And the parent's just not willing, which is unfortunate, but it happens. Everyone's human. Everyone has their own story. And you do see clients that make the decision, okay, well, for my mental health, the sanity of my children, X, Y, and Z, it may be better not to interact as often or interact at all. But I will say, because I know going no contact has become quite the buzzword, I would say, in the most recent years. A lot of the clients that I work with, that's not a decision that's taken lightly or a decision that hasn't come with multiple rounds of attempts of trying. Because at the end of the day, just like we want our kids to kind of keep us around in their lives as parents, we who are also former children, and we want to have our parents remain in our lives. It's almost the abnormal route to have to cut out a parent that's still alive. Right. So it's not something that I would say it's taken lightly. And I'll even see, it's very popular in social media. You'll see kids talking about, like, I went no contact, but you'll also see the parents that have said, like, my son doesn't talk to me. I don't know why. And what I love about the comment sections, especially in this generation, it's always comments of people that are, the people that are of our generation that are saying, well, how many attempts have they tried to talk to you about this? Or how many times have they tried to work with you and you've just not. It's never a like, your son is wrong. It's always like, kids don't just get here. There's a lot of attempts. Exactly. And that's kind of one of the biggest things I'll see. But obviously the goal of you working through your inner child and parenting your child is that you don't get to the point where your child is now considering no contact. It's the reason we're having this conversation today, and is because parents are working on those inner child triggers and trying to parent differently, so that way when their kids come of age, it's a better conversation. Right. It's easier conversation. We can have a lot more acknowledgement of my rights and my wrongs versus I didn't do that to you. I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Stop lying.
Yeah, exactly.
So last question I'll probably ask you is crying. I feel like crying could be a form of healing.
Absolutely.
How important is it to cry when you're healing?
I don't think it's necessarily about crying as much as it's making sure you're having an emotional release. So if you're in the process of healing, the whole point to heal is to make it so whatever that trauma is no longer impacting you so greatly.
Because for me, when I think about that, I think about crying. I think about it's almost like it's you letting go of the old.
Absolutely.
Okay. Right.
Crying is a form of letting go, but just like I said, sometimes it's verbalizing it. Sometimes you've been keeping it so inside that you verbalize and need to get it out. And that may also lead you to cry as well. Crying can be a very healing release, but it's not everyone's healing release. And just because you may not be a crier does not mean you're not emotionally releasing. And the goal is to make sure as someone that's going through trauma, that you're getting it out. So if your trauma was lack of voice, I want you to be voicing. I want you to be talking. I want you to be getting it out. If your trauma was like physical abuse or something, then release is, and healing, true healing comes from you getting yourself into such a place of peace and safety that the talk of someone even abusing you is like, that's too much of a red flag. I won't even entertain that. I've put up enough boundaries and protecting my peace and my safety. And again, a lot of trauma comes with tears, because crying is also a way to show hurt.
Yeah.
And pain, while also a way to, there's happy tears.
Yeah.
A way to emotionally release, but we don't get tied up on whether or not a client has cried, on whether or not they're actually healing.
Okay.
That's not my litmus test. My litmus test is literally your actions that are now coming as a result of us kind of delving into the trauma and how you're kind of rebuilding yourself again.
Interesting. I always thought it was like, you see somebody who's so angry. I was like, why are you so mad, man? You need a good cry. You know what I mean? Like, but I guess that's...
Or they need a hug. Or they need to be able to talk. There's reasons for that.
Yeah.
It could be all of that. It could be they grew up with parents that weren't emotional. Or I often hear sometimes parents that don't say I love you. So then they go out into the world and they're around people that say I love you, and it's like jarring. Like, why are you saying these words to me? How do I receive that? And then they get into a relationship with someone that says I love you, and then it's like a disconnect, you know? So these traumas and triggers come up in many different ways, and people emotionally heal and release in many different ways.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good to know. So I don't have to always say, go
where's
cry.
The tears? No.
Okay. All right. Good. Well, I appreciate you coming out again. I really love our talks, honestly.
Me too.
I love
we be
these
getting
conversations.
to the nitty gritty.
Yeah, and it's needed.
It is needed.
So if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. If you have any questions or comments for Tiffany, you can reach her
at Transformative Destiny for any of the social medias. My website is transformativedestiny.com, or via email, tiffany@transformativedestiny.com.
Cool. Yeah, we have one more episode left.
Yes.
The last episode of Motherhood Unfiltered coming at you, and it's a doozy.
It is. I don't even know what the topic is.
Yeah, we'll find out.
That's how you know it's a doozy. It's a surprise.